The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is, I think I'm counting correctly, the 39th episode of our internationale season. For full context, I'm pretty sure I had planned on doing something like 12 episodes of internationale, but I started doing multi-part episodes, and then I kept accidentally finding more people to talk about, and then here we all are. Now, I do want to say technically, this is the finale of Vulgar History Season 5, Tits Out Internationale. What was the full title? It was Tits Out Sans Frontières, Scandaliciousness Without Borders. Yes, but there is going to be another episode next week, so I'm not just like abandoning you like that. There is going to be I think it'll be our 3rd annual Tits Out Festive Holiday Super Spectacular. That's next week. But yeah, so we're wrapping up this international journey. What a journey it's been. I don't want to, you can listen to all the episodes to learn about everything that we learned. But my goal with the international season was really to really intentionally diversify the people who I'm learning about, so that diversifies who I get to talk to you about. And I was really leaning heavily on suggestions from you, the Tits Out Brigade. And almost all the episodes this season were, other than the ones that I just kept accidentally finding myself, were specifically suggestions from you. In some cases where I found it harder to find information to learn about, I was able to, Tits Out Brigade members stepped up and helped explain things to me. Some people even sent me recordings of their voices pronouncing words to try and help me. So It's been such a, I just feel the arms of the Tits Out Brigade wrapped around me all season, just suggesting things and helping out. And it's been really fun. And another thing that's happened too is because we're talking about all these international places, and because I have repeatedly asked you to do this, Tits Out Brigade members have been sending me pictures when they go to places we've mentioned in the stories recently-ish. I forget the name of the person who sent them, but I think it was Sarah, sent pictures from the Gallery of Beauties in that castle in Germany where Ludwig put the picture of Lola Montez. I was just like, oh my God, like grifter icon Lola Montez, just her portrait in this like castle, iconic. I also was sent a picture by somebody who was visiting the Vatican and saw the like surprisingly large memorial to Christina of Sweden. So if you ever, even if it's like 5 years from now, whatever, like go to one of the places ever mentioned on this podcast, like please send me a picture. I don't do much traveling and I love to see these things and to share them with others. Anyway, I've learned so much this season. I'm not going to be like, okay, that was fun. Like now back to only England. Like, no, like this has like changed how I research. I've learned so many more sources and so many more contexts of different countries. So like in the seasons to come, and there will be numerous more seasons of Vulgar History, like there will definitely still be an international focus, because I think I stated in the first episode of this season that one of my goals was to talk about a scandalicious woman from every country from which there is a member of the Tits Out Brigade, and there's still lots of countries I haven't done. So please keep sending me suggestions. Please send me pictures of if you go to one of these places. And there will be another episode next week. It's just like the international season, the season that just would not let go of me. This is the finale of that season, not of the show, and not of episodes for this year. Anyway, so today, to wrap things up, I kind of like that this is where we're landing, which is, again, like not at all what I had planned. Things got a bit out of order based on various things you don't need to know about. But anyway, we finished the story of Empress Dowager Cixi last week, and we're going back a slightly earlier time period from her, although there's a bit of crossover. We're still in China in the Qing Dynasty era, because we're talking about someone who is, I usually try to say like, hey, thanks to so-and-so from the Tits Out Brigade for suggesting this person, but so many people suggested this person, I don't have a record of all the people who there were. But I will say that when I first started researching this, like last March, I had in my notes here that Erica and Vivian had suggested this. But since then, I would say dozens of people. We're talking about the most successful pirate of all time, not just the most successful lady pirate, the most successful pirate of all time, who was a woman, and the name that she's known by is mostly Zheng Yi Sao. But like, what would it be as an episode of the international season of Vulgar History if there wasn't like 5 to 10 minutes of explanation about like, was that her name? And here's what name I'm going to use. So like with the Cixi episode, I really found it helpful to listen to podcasts hosted by people, by Asian people talking about Asian history, because there's context and nuance and pronunciations there that I appreciate learning. And so specifically for this episode, I listened to the episode about Zheng Yi Sao from the podcast With Chinese Characteristics, which is a great podcast hosted by Natalie and Cherie. Super recommend that. And also the Asian American History 101 podcast, hosted by Jen and Ted. So both of them have episodes about Zheng Yi Sao, which I listened to and took notes about. So I use them both as sources, but I also recommend them just as shows to listen to. I also really appreciated a lot of you. There's just that thing, the Spotify Wrapped, where if you listen to this podcast on Spotify, which like a lot of you are, you get the thing saying like, here's how much you listen to this, and here's like the most podcasts you listen to and whatever, which I really appreciated. And I honestly, is like really moving to me to see how many people listen to this podcast. I know people listen to this podcast, but to see specifically people sending me their Spotify Wrapped, I was like, oh, look, these are like real people, not just like theoretic, imaginary people. Anyway, I did notice that several of them also listen to this podcast. And if you don't, I recommend it too. It's called You're Dead to Me, which is a podcast it's from the BBC. It's hosted by Greg Jenner, who is a public historian. He also describes himself as the head nerd behind Horrible Histories. And after having talked about Charles II, I know that a lot of people across the Atlantic in like Great Britain and also in Ireland, like watch that show, because the number of people who've also referenced how sexy you find Charles II, as portrayed on Horrible Histories, it was notable. Anyway, so You're Dead to Me podcast, their episode about Zheng Yi Sao. featured Professor Ronald C. Poe, who is a specialist. Like his expertise is in like Qing Dynasty, China, specifically the Maritimes. Like, so in terms of who you're going to talk to about like a Chinese pirate from this era, he's like the guy. So I was just like listening to this podcast, like taking down basically a transcription of everything he said, because he had some facts that I didn't encounter in other places. So that's super recommend that in his work. I also referred to a book I looked at for some other episodes before, Pirate Women by Laura Suk Duncombe. Here's Hepburn. I don't know that there's any information about pirate cats, but often I think you do have cats on ships for mousing purposes. So perhaps Hepburn's ancestors were there as well. Anyway, Pirate Women by Laura Suk Duncombe is a book that I recommend too. Also some information from the Encyclopedia of Women's Biography, an article by Tanner Price on the Pirates and Privateers website, Wikipedia as ever, an article on Atlas Obscura by Urvita Banerjee, and also an article by Zuting Christine Ni on the Sixth Tone, which she's a woman who's either in China or like is from China, and so her perspective and point of view I found really interesting and useful to include. So I also appreciate that the season, which has been like, I have to say, like a wild ride, very fun for me, but also there's been sort of like themes that emerge, and one of them has been this like late season theme of like suddenly just like pirates. Like the amount of times I've gone back to Pirate Women and some other books about piracy is just like, oh, okay. Because we had Saida Al-Hura early on. It's like she's kind of known as a pirate queen. Was she a pirate? Like, meh, not maybe. Was she friends with pirates? Sure. But then we also talked about Artemisia I of Caria, who also is listed sometimes in things about pirates because she was a woman with a ship and she ran her ship into the other ship. And so I think honorary pirate for sure. We had the interview with Daphne Palmer Giannakopoulos about Sarah Kidd, who was not herself a pirate, but she was the wife of a pirate. So although we have talked about piracy on this podcast, Zheng Yi Sao was the first like literal pirate I think we've profiled on this show. So this is taking place like slightly before the whole sushi situation. So it's the Qing Dynasty, but like the Qing Dynasty was a thing in China for like 300 years. But this is like just before. So a lot of the stuff that I talked about, what was going on, like before things got really chaotic in her life / in China, like part 2 of Sushi. A lot of this is the same, like the Confucian society, the gender roles, the foot binding, like that's all still going on here. So the emperor during most of this story was Qianlong, who is the great-grandfather of Sushi's husband. So it's like that long before her time. So Qianlong was actually, unlike the emperors in like all of Sushi's story, he was actually like a well-regarded emperor. He was like, his reign was basically the most prosperous period in all of Qing history. He ruled for 60 years, and he didn't stop ruling because he died or like, you know, had health conditions. He just chose to retire at that point, like age 85, out of respect for his grandfather, because his grandfather had ruled for 61 years. So, and that was the longest serving monarch of the Qing Dynasty, and he didn't want to like upset his grandfather's record, so he just retired after ruling for 60 years, so as to not get to 61 years, which I think just is an interesting, fun trivia point, but also really talks about or demonstrates how in this culture that we're looking at, there's a sense of respect and honoring your elders was a big thing. So under his rule, which had been, again, like very prosperous, China had gotten even larger. It had gotten really as big as it had ever been really quickly. And like anything, like when anything gets too big too fast, it's like, how do you stay on top of it? How can you be in control? Especially when you think of like a landmass the size of, it's not exactly the size of modern day China, but it's like similar. Even if you think of just of modern day China, it's like a huge area. So like in the sushi episode, it's just like there can be rebellions and riots happening all over the place and you wouldn't know about it because there wasn't phones. Like, how could you know? Anyway, so the other thing about this guy, Emperor Qianlong, was that he also was fond of spending money on luxuries for himself. And that sort of was a role model for the other wealthy people to also act that same way, which left people in the provinces, like the less wealthy people, struggling financially. And because it was China during the Qing Dynasty, Of course, there's going to be rebellion led by a super secret, sexy religious cult. In this case, it was the White Lotus Rebellion, led by the White Lotus Society. Oh, I looked at this. There's been so many religious, spiritual rebellions in these stories. I think they had something about like either their leader was the reincarnation of the Buddha or they were like waiting for the Buddha or something like that. Anyway, White Lotus Society was unsuccessful, but they were plentiful. There was a lot of them. This rebellion went on for several years. And so the cost of fighting them depleted the government's money. They had to spend so much money fighting off the White Lotus Society. So to make this money back, the emperor raised taxes, raised import duties, and remember, this is also before the country was really open to the West, which happened so much more during Sushi's life. So I think this is import duties for the people they're dealing with, which I think was like Vietnam, Japan, like other Asian countries. Anyway, import duties, taxes being raised. This affected not the wealthy people living in Beijing, but it really especially affected people in Guangdong, which is a coastal region in the south of China, which is where most of the story takes place. And in fact, it was in Guangdong where this week's heroine was born around 1775. So her birth name was probably Shi Yang or maybe Sek Yung, but later in life, she became known as Zheng Yi Sao, and that is how she is widely known in most of the resources that I've been looking at about her. And if for this podcast, we're looking at kind of like raising the profile of lesser known women in history, although I feel like she's like a pretty well-known person in history, I want to use the name that she's mostly referred to by. So it's a Sayyida al-Hura situation. It's a harem sultan situation. It's, I don't know how many other people this season. It's a Melanzine situation. Like, I'm using a name I know people called her when she was alive, and even though that wasn't the name with which she was born. So she's also sometimes written about in English language as Ching Shih or Ching Shih, sometimes as Madame Ching, various different things. We're going with Zheng Yi Sao. So for context, she was born, as I said, 1775. That was 60 years before the birth of Cixi. So the two of them did overlap, like being alive for a little bit towards the end of Zheng Yi Sao's life, beginning of Cixi's life, but just 60 years can be quite a significant period of time when there's this much kind of instability happening in the world. So in terms of people we've talked about on this podcast, 1775 was shortly after the birth of Caroline of Brunswick from our very first ever episode, and around 20 years before Mary Shelley was born. So that's kind of what's happening in, well, England, I guess. Obviously, we don't know anything about her childhood. Like, we don't even really quite know what her name was, but we talked about that in the Cixi episode, where it's kind of like girls in Qing Dynasty, their names kind of didn't matter. You were just called like older sister or younger sister, and then you get married, and then you're called so-and-so's wife. But also in general, like, we don't know anything about her childhood because she was a lower class girl born in the 18th century, like whether that's in China or anywhere, like as we've seen time and time again on this podcast. If you're not a princess, then no one really knows what you did until you suddenly started doing things that weren't important. But here's what we do know. I don't know if you can hear Hepburn, but she is like purring up a storm directly next to the microphone. I hope that's like soothing for you. It's like an ASMR moment. She grew up in Guangdong. Yeah, the stuff we talked about with Cixi, still in play here, except, so it's a poor neighborhood. So, you know, the stuff about like gender expectations, where it's like women and men can never like interact, women and girls have to stay inside all the time. That was not so strictly enforced in Guangdong among the working class and poor people, because it's not practical to keep girls and women trapped at home with their feet bound all the time, because you need hands on deck. Like, literally, this is a pirate story in a shipping town. Like, you need them as workers. So women and girls were maybe less. They were allowed to do more stuff because everyone needed to help out, because they had to, because it's unless you were really super wealthy, it's like you can't really afford to just like keep your daughters in the house doing nothing all the time, which is interesting to note in contrast to what we talked about with Cixi, because so much of the history of the Qing Dynasty era that is recorded is about the royals and the wealthy people and what they were up to and how bound they were by the Confucian values and ethics. But in this story, in Guangdong, that's like not the top of anyone's priorities. They're more busy like making money to feed their family, have a roof over their head. Not really a lot of time to like really get into like the ethics of Confucian philosophy. So Guangdong, which is where she was born and probably grew up, was and is, well, like, it is an area now that's like a huge port town. And back then it was also huge in the sense of the population of this region was like 20 million people. So huge coastline. This is the region where Macau and Canton are. Canton was the name it was known by then. It's now called Guangzhou. So most of the people who lived in this region then relied on the sea for their livelihood. Like, it's a port town, like anything, like, I don't know, like oldie times, places in the Greek islands, or like, I don't know, Boston, where I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's just like a place with a port where it's just like, there's fishermen, there's merchants. And then other businesses pop up because there's so many fishermen and merchants around. They need whatever, hotels and restaurants and things. So here there's also waterboat men, which is kind of like ferries. So fish like don't care that this is the livelihood. Like, fish would migrate during part of the year because that's just like what they're up to. So the people who are fishermen were just like, well, fuck, I can't be a fisherman. All the fish just like migrated. So as like a side hustle, the fishermen would be like fishermen part of the year and then like pirates the other part of the year, just to kind of make ends meet. Because again, it's like everyone's got to have a side hustle. So this is just like the region where she's growing up. It's giving me like New Orleans in the Interview with the Vampire original movie, like just kind of, because that's also kind of like 1700s, but just like a port town where there's just lots of people, lots of criminal activity happening, but also lots of businesses, just kind of like people making their lives on the sea. Just inherently, like, piracy is gonna come up. In terms of like what's happening, I don't know, politically or culturally, so throughout her childhood, Zheng Yi Sao's childhood, there had been this civil war happening in Vietnam. So Vietnam then is basically where Vietnam still is. It's a country just to the south of China, sharing a land border. Actually, side note, because I talked in the Artemisia of Caria episode about like the oldest civilizations, like what places were countries or kingdoms and like are still countries and kingdoms. And I wanted to double check because I know just from like casual Googling, I learned that China is another one of the oldest cultures in the world. So the list I found in order of like oldestest. So Iran, the oldest, like that was Persian Empire. Japan, also super old. Greece, Ethiopia, Georgia, not the one in the US, American listeners. Georgia, the like country in Eastern Europe. China, also on this list. Afghanistan, India, and Egypt are some of the oldest places that are still countries now, but that have been countries for the longest. So like when we're talking about China and Vietnam, what happens in Vietnam affects what happens in China and had for hundreds and hundreds of years. So at this point, what was going on is the Taishan Rebellion, which, like all these rebellions, lasted a really long time. In fact, this rebellion lasted 2 decades. And so some of these freelance pirates of Guangdong took part. Like they were freelance pirates. I feel like that could be some new merch. We've got freelance queen, freelance pirate. Yeah, so they just like took jobs as mercenaries to like help out in this battle because the people in the Taishan Rebellion, both sides, needed people either to help smuggle stuff around or to like bring their ships to help out in battles, etc. So this was keeping the pirates of Guangdong pretty busy when they weren't, fishing. So we don't know, again, anything about Zheng Yi Sao from age birth until when she was like 25 years old. And we know about her when she was 25 years old because at that point she was working on a flower boat, which was, perhaps still is, kind of a floating brothel. She was working as a sex worker. So, flower boats. Given how busy and populated Guangdong was and how many people were at sea all the time, a floating brothel makes total business sense. You can like float your flower boat out near where there's like a fleet is visiting, or you can like take your flower boat like along the coast. Like maybe there's no one in that town, but maybe there's people in the next town who like could be customers. So it's just a thing that was happening. And she's 25. So I'm gonna make some assumptions here, which is that I think she probably would have started being a sex worker on a flower boat age 25. She probably had been doing it for a while, perhaps. And so she was also, allegedly, was successful in this career job, but also she was like smart. She was like getting her scheming on in that she was able to charm the various men who were being her paid clients, which included pirates, but maybe also like government people, to share secrets with her. And then she could trade those secrets to other people. So she was like a sex worker slash kind of spy in that like Mata Hari sort of way. So yeah, this is what she was up to. And then suddenly one day, why do we know about her? It's because when she was about 25 years old, she one day was recorded as marrying the most famous pirate of this age and region, who was called Zheng Yi. He was like 10 years older than her. So he was like 35, she was like 25. In terms of ages of people getting married for vulgar history, this is like normal-ish sounding. Anyway, so his name was Zheng Yi. And when they got married, that's when she started being known as Zheng Yi Sao, which means the wife of Zheng Yi. And I'll try and say their names very specifically because, so she's Zheng Yi Sao and the husband is Zheng Yi. So I think it'll be apparent when I'm talking which one I'm talking about. So let's talk about this guy. So he was also from the Guangdong region. His family went back generations as pirates because that was the sort of region and era that it was. His father was a pirate. His younger brother was also a pirate. I'm going to guess his grandfather was a pirate. He comes from a long line of like pirate biz. So he was one of the pirates who got involved in the Tay Son Rebellion in Vietnam. And a few years before he met and married Zheng Yi Sao, he had kidnapped a 15-year-old boy called Zheng Baozai, who was the son of a fisherman. And this is like we talked about in the sushi episode. It's like having an heir is important. So if he was like, 30 years old at that point, didn't have a son, like he needed someone who would take over the family biz because it's like an inherited pirate title. So he just kind of kidnapped this guy, this teenage boy. And I think that's normal for pirates, not just here, but other places. What's it called where you like forcibly grab people and make them be pirates? Like that's just like how you get new pirates all the time. You just kind of like, I forget there's a word for it. Anyway, so Zheng Baozai, the like boy, had natural talent. He adapted well to this unplanned new career and he rose swiftly through the ranks. He's going to be a main character later, which is why I'm talking about him now. So Zheng Baozai, the boy, had been with Zheng Yi for like a couple years by now. He was maybe 17 at the point that Zheng Yi married Zheng Yi Sao. So there are some references to the fact that maybe Zheng Yi and Zheng Baozai were like lovers, like that he had kidnapped this boy to be his boy concubine, which is like maybe. But there's some other stuff that comes up in this story that just makes me think of so many other stories this season where it's like, if you're trying to exoticize, like if you, by you, I guess I mean white men writers of Western Europe, if they're trying to tell like a sexy, fun story, they're just like, and also they also had lots of sex. So it's like in the story with Harem Sultan, how the like people from the West weren't allowed to come into the harem, which made them be like, what's happening in the harem? I guess it's lots of like weird orgy shit where it's like, that's just more about you than about what's happening behind closed doors. Like if you are, the only thing you can imagine is like weird sex stuff, which is not to say that Zheng Yi did not kidnap this boy to become his concubine, but it's kind of like, I'm dubious about that. Not because I don't support, well, do I support 30-year-old men kidnapping teenage boys? No. It's just like, queer stuff in history is so, like we talked about this in the episode with Kit Hyam and also the episode with Maya Dean, where it's just kind of like, there's these references to things and you're like, is this genuinely what was going on, or is this just somebody making stuff up to make somebody look bad because it would have made them look bad at the time? Anyway, I don't know. So just know if you're researching this, some people suggest that these two had a sexual relationship as well as being adopted father and apprentice pirate. I just have a quote here. So Diane Murray is a writer who, she like literally wrote the book, like the first English language book about Zheng Yi Sao. And she says, unlike in the West, adult adoption was often practiced in China in order to establish a kinship basis for further interaction, particularly of a business or discipleship sort, says Diane Murray. Zheng Yi adopting an adolescent fisherman's son was not too out of the ordinary. Anyway, moving on. We don't know how or why Zheng Yi Sao was chosen to marry Zheng Yi. One source suggested he sought her out because she was like famous as like the glamorous, like most beautiful or whatever sex worker on this flower boat. Other sources suggested she sought him out, like maybe from her like pillow talk spy work. She learned that he was like the best pirate and she's like, I want to align with him. So I don't know if he sought her out, if she convinced him to, if like they already had like a relationship as one of her clients, but whatever transpired, these two got married and became the glamorous new pirate it couple on the scene. So women on boats. In contrast to in the West, where it was often seen as like unlucky to have a woman on a boat, it was common for South Chinese pirates to bring their whole families to sea, like not just their wife, but also their children. Women commonly engaged in combat and performed other duties on board the ships. It's kind of like, this is like maybe a niche comparison, Star Trek's The Next Generation, where on the Enterprise, they have like the people, like the Star Trek crew is there, but also the ones that are married, like their spouse is also there, even if they don't work for Starfleet, and like their kids are there, and there's a school there, and that was all put on the show to show like, look how peaceful it is in the future, but quickly they realize like the show is boring if it's always peace. So the Enterprise starts getting into fights and stuff, and there's parts where they're like, abandoned ship, and I'm just like, is there still the school on this ship? Like, are there still like spouses and children? Like, this just seems like unwise. Anyway, but you know, it's like what the flower boat is floating around, like these pirate ships are floating around, and so it's a great way to keep a family together. Shortly after the marriage of Zheng Yi Sao and Zheng Yi, the Tyson Rebellion in Vietnam came to an end, which meant all these freelance pirates came back to Guangdong, sort of just kind of like unemployed pirates. Maybe the fish were still away. They're just like, I don't know what to do. Like, anyone have any work for us? And so Zheng Yi and Zheng Yi Sao were like, hey, we're a glamorous pirate couple. Do you want to come work for us? And so they start putting together what turns out to be an organized fleet of pirates. And it's kind of like in the movie Newsies, where all the newsies of all the boroughs come together, but they each have their own, kind of like their own style and their own accent. You know, one group has like the slingshots, and one group like wears top hats or whatever. So the different pirate groups just joined under the flag, but like still with their own kind of style. So like truly, like Zheng Yi Sao and her husband put together this confederation of pirates, which was like a new radical thing. So there was 6 squadrons. Each one was named after the flags that they had, which were either black, blue, white, yellow, and purple, except red was the other color, which was the one Zheng Yi commanded the biggest fleet, the red flag fleet. And so within a few years, these pirate married couple, they had around 400 ships and something like 70,000 sailors, men mostly, under their command, which is part of where we're talking about, like, she's the most successful pirate of all time. Like, no one else had this many. But why is it just she's the greatest pirate of all time? Well, stay tuned. Yeah, so Zheng Yi was captain of the Red Fleet. Zheng Yi Sao helped with administrative work, which we're going to see she's like very skilled with. But then 6 years into married life, during which time they might have had 2 sons. Some sources mention that. Anyway, just after 6 years of marriage, Zheng Yi died in a pirate sort of way, which is he either was drowned in a huge typhoon or he was potentially killed by a cannonball during battle, which leaves Zheng Yi Sao without a husband and 70,000 pirates who need a new leader. And I think you know what's coming next, which is that she takes over. So she did this by securing the support of the 2 kind of like next most important pirates, the 2 leading chieftains of the fleet. And she really just took over. Like, if you're looking for a story like Sushi, where it's like she had to scheme and she had to like do all this stuff and like trick everybody and use loopholes, it's like, no, she truly just like took over. As commander of everything, her adopted son, Zhang Bozai, was captain because like that was not her strong suit, like the sailing of the ships. She was good at the like administrative, managerial role. She also, at this point, married him. So please note, Zhang Bozai, the adopted son of Zheng Yi, is at this point like 24. And she's like, I don't know, 30 or so. And they met when he was 17. So while this is all, to me, unconventional, this could have been much weirder. Like, just look back at the Cleopatra episode for more about how much weirder and incestuous this could have been. So I will just say he was an adult man. They met when he was 17. And they have no blood relation. and they have a successful partnership. And I don't know if this was a marriage of like a love marriage or like a sexy marriage. Like, again, these like sexy rumors, which I think in the very first episode ever, not of this season, but of Vulgar History ever, at some point I know I've shared my past theory, which is that in history, if it seems like two people were fucking, like they probably were. Like, let's not overthink it. Since then, and with everything I've learned and how much women in history just get smeared by people being like, when they can't find anything else, like the men writing about them can't find anything else to criticize, they're like, and also she was a slut. Like Manuela Sands, for instance, some people wrote about her as the harlot of the Americas, which is like, I'm sorry, she like married one guy, left him for Simon Bolivar, and dedicated the whole rest of her life to Simon Bolivar. Like, she wasn't sleeping around. It's like, it's the Cleopatra thing again. It's just kind of like, well, like when Wild Fox Kang was saying that about sushi, it's like, if somebody was the whore of the Americas, good for you. Like, love that for you. But sometimes it just seems, yeah, Hepburn is lost to say this week. I don't know. It's just kind of like, I see through it, you know? So there's some people who say that maybe Zheng Yi Sao was a lover of Zheng Bozai, and maybe they killed her husband so they could be together, or maybe like the three of them were in a throuple, and like any of these things are possibly true, but like what's the motivation for saying that? Is it just to, you know, further exoticize, quote unquote, this like Asian women, or is it a way to just be like, these pirates, like, ooh, they were also like unhinged or whatever? It's like, maybe there was like a father, wife, son love triangle, and maybe there wasn't. I don't know. Anyway, these two got married. They might have gotten married just for like political expediency, just so she could be like, I have a husband, don't worry about it, and like, we're in charge. Or maybe they were like secretly in love, or maybe they got married and then fell in love later, like in a romance novel with like enemies to lovers or whatever. Who knows? Who cares? Like, she's just getting started. Let's go. So a bit about her new husband, Zheng Baozai. So he had been the son of a fisherman. He was, again, I can't remember that word, but like kidnapped into being a pirate. But it turns out, great choice. He's well suited for it. He was like a military sort of guy, but he just didn't have the skill set for the administrative stuff that Zheng Yi Sao was like clearly really good with. And I think that's where I listened to the episode of the Oldest Profession podcast, which is a podcast about sex workers of history. And the host there was theorizing that Zheng Yi Sao had a lot of this skill set to do this because of her sex work, like because she knew about how to do paperwork. She knew about how, you know, people could work together in a group. She knew, I don't know, she knew how to negotiate. Like, those were maybe transferable skills from her previous work on the flower boat. Anyway, I had mentioned earlier, like, there was sometimes women pirates. Like, that wasn't super weird in China at this time, but it was rare to have a woman pirate leader, the same way it was rare to have a woman anything leader in China at this point / ever. Like, this is, again, like, still decades before Cixi takes over. And she only took over, like, Asterix as regent. And the only female Chinese monarch before Cixi was 1,000 years before this, and that was Wu Zetian. And that has also been very frequently requested for this podcast. And I will talk about that at some point. Anyway, so a woman leader, like, Zheng Yi Sao was just like, I'm not here to, like, break the glass ceiling. I just want to be, like, a fucking awesome pirate, so let's just go. So, kind of like how I talked about the emperor was having trouble because China, like, got too big too quickly. It's like, how can you be in control of such a huge amount of space? But also, Zheng Yi Sao has this issue, like, how can she be in charge of this gigantic multi-fleet pirate force? Like, how can she keep all these people in line? To do so, she enforced strict law codes. And these law codes were, previously, the men on a pirate ship would be loyal to a single captain, but they're the fleet, so everyone needs to be loyal to her, commander of all of the fleets. Well, I guess technically her and her husband were in command of the fleets, but, like, she's running the show. So here are some of the rules. So disobedience of an order resulted in the pirate's decapitation and his body thrown into the sea. So, like, it's not a 3 strikes thing. Like, if you don't obey your rules, then, like, your head's cut off. Au revoir. Also, if you gave commands without being a commander, so if you're, like, I don't know, a non-commander, just like basic pirate, you can't give commands. If you steal from the fleet's treasury, and if you rob the village that supplies the pirates, you also get decapitation, body thrown in the sea. So, you know what, easy to remember. Like, if that's always a punishment, then just, like, don't break any rules. If you're deserted or if you were absent without leave, that would result in a pirate being paraded through the squadrons with their ears cut off. I would rephrase that as that would result in having your ears cut off, and then you get paraded through the squadrons. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors, including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. Captured women. Okay. This is interesting too, and they talk about this on the You're Dead to Me podcast, but also on the Oldest Profession podcast. Because some of these rules that Zheng Yi Sao implements, I have to assume, are based on her experience having worked on the flower boat and having just really wanting women to have an okay time on the pirate ships without having to deal with too much fuckery. So, women were captured as part of pirate biz. That's just what happens. So captured women who are found unattractive would be released without harm. I mean, good for them, I guess, but also kind of an insult. Attractive women could be divided between the crews as loot or purchased as wives. So if a pirate earned or purchased a wife, he was required to be faithful to her, so like enforced monogamy, or else face execution by decapitation and having his body thrown into the sea. So again, that's just like Zheng Yi Sao thought of a punishment, and she's like, guess what this is? The punishment for everything. So this whole thing about the women, I just said like, she wanted women to be treated okay. And it's like, what are you talking about, Anne? Like, did you not just say women could be divided between crews as loot or purchased as wives? I did say that. But further rule says that rape, non-consensual sex between a pirate and a woman captive would mean that the man would be decapitated, body thrown in the sea. So like you could get the women as loot, but you could not then rape them. I guess they just became like new crew members. Not sure what that situation would be. And then there was also a rule that If a pirate has sex with a woman and then doesn't marry her, then guess what? Decapitation, body thrown in the sea. And the women also, I think, would be thrown in the sea, but like with weights attached to her. So it was kind of in the best interest. Like if you wanted to have sex with one of the women, like you needed to agree to marry her. And then once you're married to her, you had to be faithful to her as well. But then what does faithful to her even mean? Because Zheng Yi Sao also forbid consensual sex. So like once you had married the prisoner, or once the prisoner had been married to the pirate, like you could stay on the ship, like I said, like Star Trek's The Next Generation. Wives and children could be there, but you couldn't have sex when you were on duty because Zheng Yi Sao felt that like distracted you from your work. So if you were found out to have had consensual sex on duty, meant head cut off, thrown in the sea for both of you, for the woman and for the man. So some real specific rules here. Now, there's some debate about did Zheng Yi Sao herself create these rules, or did she collaborate with her husband, Zheng Baozai? Did they work? Some people say like, well, Zheng Baozai wrote up the rules because like Zheng Yi Sao didn't know how to write. But it's like, I feel like the amount of paperwork she did, she probably learned how to write at some point. Anyway, here's what we know for sure. Whoever came up with these rules, Zheng Yi Sao was the commander of the fleet of the Pirate Confederation, and she was the one enforcing these rules. So it's not like she had nothing to do with them. There's also some religion aspects of all of this. So the religion in this context, parts of the Six Flag fleets were notoriously religion. So when they went on a mission or a raid, they would like pray to the gods for safety and good fortune. So Zheng Yi Sao and her husband built a magnificent temple aboard one of the largest vessels, which became the center of ritual for the leaders before every mission. So before every mission, the leaders would burn incense and beseech their gods for the holy favor. But before that happened, like before the actual like ceremony, Zheng Baozai would meet in secret with the priests to like tell them like, here's what I want the gods to say today. And so as fate would have it, the gods always seemed to smile on their crew, blessing them in their endeavors from these religious ceremonies. Yeah, and so there was like religious stability. People felt like her leadership was like, her and her husband's leadership was maybe like sort of divinely ordained, like the gods were blessing them. They also had all these rules to follow. And morale became really high. Like all the pirates in the fleets loved being part of this pirate confederation of pirates under Zheng Yi Sao and her husband. In terms of religious stuff, apparently Zheng Yi Sao was very suspicious. Quite a bit of what we know about her and what was going on was there's a British captive named Richard Glasspool who later wrote about them where it's like, okay, Glasspool, like, do we trust everything he says? How much is it him, like, misinterpreting what he sees because he's coming from such a different cultural context and he, I don't think, spoke the language. But anyway, he wrote that Zheng Yi Sao sprinkled her captives with garlic water, which was believed to be protection against getting shot. Apparently, she never made decisions without first consulting a particular guardian spirit. And she kept statues of this spirit on each of her ships, but which spirit she allegedly sought guidance from is unknown. And in terms of her, like, commander managerial role, so she controlled over all finances and operations, which again, I feel like is a transferable skill from having been a sex worker. There was so she set up this rule, a strict division of wealth. So when any of the parts of the fleets raided a place, 20% of whatever was gathered would be divided among the crew who like actually were involved in the raid, and the other 80% would be put in the like main treasury for like to support the whole fleet as a whole. As I mentioned, if you take money beyond that 20%, you would have your head cut off and thrown in the sea. Like, so she had, I don't know, it's giving me union, it's giving me just like workers' rights. Like, of course people were cool being in this pirate fleet. Like, she just like, I'm always in admiration of someone who's just like a good leader. Like, it's so rare to be like actually good at this and to get people to trust you. And I love the girl boss of it all. Speaking of, she was not just a pirate. She also was an entrepreneur, and she had her own side hustle, which was controlling the salt industry. So in this era, most salt was produced, the most salt, I don't know if it's like in the world or just in this region. Anyway, so a lot of salt was produced in the Guangdong province, and then it would be moved up the coast to the port of Canton. And so the salt that was produced was found in salterns, which is a word I had not heard, Saltern, So these were pools of salt water, which produced salt, which was then left to evaporate, and that's where salt came from. So each year, like 4 times a year, large fleets from the government, like working for the emperor, would ship salt to Canton, like to the port. And this is a very profitable business for the government. And Zheng Yi Sao saw this happening, and she's like, okay, but what if this was a profitable business for me and the pirate fleet? So her fleet attacked the salt fleets, like the government salt fleets, basically took over the ships and made them deliver the salt to like her. So she became so successful that, so the government had 270 salt ships. And after she like set her sights on this, only 4 of those remained outside of her control. And I think those ones remained outside of her control because those ships just kind of like wouldn't leave port. They're like, the winds are bad. We can't go sailing today. Oh, well, because they didn't want to be attacked by her. So she would capture these ships and then force the people manning these government ships, salt ships, to work for her instead of for the government. And therefore, she took over the entire salt industry. She also introduced what is described sometimes as a passport system, which is one of the first passport systems ever, I think, in the history of anything. And this is part of her regulation of the salt industry. So it's called a passport system. I mean, it's basically just like a protection racket, like one might hear about any gang doing anywhere in the world where there's gangs. So this passport system, quote unquote, forced salt merchants to purchase a passport of safe passage from the pirates before setting out on their journey. So these ships that she had like taken control of that used to work for the government would have to like pay her for like the right to transport the salt. Soon this system extended to all sorts of merchant ships, not just salt, and fishing vessels. Even people in like the villages where the pirates would go started paying for protection as well. She's just kind of like, what if everyone just pays me money because I'm great? And everyone's like, don't want our heads cut off and bodies thrown in the sea. So sure. Even the British East India Company, at that time, the world's most powerful corporation, paid her fees for protection. She also offered like so many businesses these days, you could pay per ship or you could get an annual subscription or pay as you go for specific voyages. Like the vision of this woman, I am so in awe. And I love to see a person in exactly the right job for that person because other people in this role wouldn't have come up with this shit. She is like, were she alive today, she could write a business about just like being a girl boss and how to destroy the government salt fleet. I'm just like, I love her. I love her. So she also like, it wasn't just like her running around giving a piece of papers. Like she had teams working for her, like crews. She set up financial officers in harbors along the coast in major centers like Canton and Macau, which is where these would be like collection points for fees and to check the passports. Yeah. So through her like taking control of like the entire ocean and all merchants, she created a stable seascape that was orderly because she was in charge of it. Instead of just being this chaotic thing of all different pirate bands and all different stuff, like she was in charge of like everything. And she didn't control these people through terror. I mean, that was certainly part of it. Just like when you knew one of these fleets was coming up, especially the Red Fleet, you'd be like, okay, I'll do whatever you say, just because of their reputation. But she and her pirates also worked hard to ensure alliances with people on land. For instance, in small villages that were like isolated and it was harder for them to like get supplies, the Six Flag fleets would help provide them with delicacies, luxuries, and oddities from far-off lands, which they sold to locals for modest prices. So they came to town as like a little bookmobile type thing. Because she knew, like any skilled diplomat, a few generous gifts to the right people would go a long way in establishing relationships to make these villages loyal to them. So before long, local politicians were on the take or, paying for protection or whatever. And corruption only grew from there. So her pirate fleet secured footholds among merchants, farmers, laborers, government officials. They also, like going back to her previous skill from her sex work life, traded secrets. They traded information and intelligence with secret societies and bandit gangs. So these pirates truly had influence over every aspect of life on the Chinese coast. And then this part is like this whole story. At first I was reading, like doing the research, and I'm just like, usually in these stories that I do in the podcast, there's like challenges. Sushi, for instance, like she had to keep, People were getting in her way, people trying to stop her. But Zheng Yi Sao was so powerful. The story is just like a delightful journey of a woman who did great, kept being more great. No one could ever stop her. Like, it's just like, it's a relaxing story. Yeah. So when I say like no one tried to stop her, you're like, what about like the government? What about the emperor? Do you remember in the Sushi episode about how the Qing dynasty didn't really have very much of a navy? That was like part of her thing. She's like, I'm gonna make there be a navy, but then she like took a lot of money to build her like marble boat. The Chinese navy was not really well funded, shall we say. Their ships were not great. There was a lot of people working for them. So the navy didn't dare to oppose her because her ships and weapons and like crew were better than theirs. Each of her fleets was effectively a floating military fortress with lots of ships and cannons. It was estimated that her fleet outnumbered the Imperial Navy 3-1, which again is why a lot of the Navy ships spent most of their time in port claiming the winds were bad and they couldn't go to sea. Like, oh no, my ship's broken, I can't go out, which just made things even easier for her. And one of the reasons why their Navy was so shitty, while hers was so good, is because she had all this money from all these businesses she was running. Meanwhile, the Qing Empire couldn't afford to put together a powerful army because they bankrupted themselves through like buying too many luxury goods, but also the whole like White Lotus rebellion and stuff. Here's just some fun facts, just some pirate facts. So her pirates apparently drank before their battles a concoction of gunpowder mixed with wine. Don't try that at home. And so some of the ways that they attacked ships, like part of being a pirate, like even I know this as like a person who's watched Our Flag Means Death and maybe one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies 1,000 years ago. Like I know that part, and The Princess Bride, part of being a pirate is just like having a reputation. So when you show up, people just like give you whatever you want. So you don't actually have to work that hard when your reputation is so good. So here's how they would attack ships. So they would use grappling hooks to like climb up onto the ships to attack after having drunken gunpowder mixed with wine, which again, don't do that. One of their weapons that they used was called a Xingao, which was an 8-foot-long musket-like device, which was so like 8 feet long. It required 3 people. So 2 men would fire it as it rested on the shoulder of a third. So just imagine people climbing up a grappling hook with this like 8-foot-long musket. They would also, one of their techniques is they had another thing. They had these kind of 15 to 30 foot long posts, like I don't know what else to call it, with a razor sharp machete on the end. So just like a machete with like a 15-foot long post, and they would just like come swimming up with that. They also used handmade grenades filled with gunpowder and gin, which is interesting that they would drink the gunpowder and wine, and then they were like, oh, hey, this our favorite drink could also be a weapon. Okay. So they would come in your ship and you would just be like, okay, I give in. Like, obviously. So you would be okay if you were the person who they were attacking. As long as you gave up your booty and paid them some money, like you could probably just like go along. But that would not be the case if you, like imagining yourself, were in the service of the Imperial Navy. If they came in your ship and you were with a navy, you would probably be nailed by your feet to the deck and then chopped up in little pieces and thrown overboard to feed the sharks, which is quite a specific and strange thing to do. Instead of the like chopping off the head, throwing out the body, instead this is like chopping off the feet and throwing off the body. I don't know why you'd be nailed by your feet first. Anyway, that's what they did. And again, this is why the Navy people just were like, I'm sick today. I'm just going to not go sail in the ocean right now. Anyway, 1809. Again, everything I just described, Zheng Yi Sao had accomplished in like 8 years. This is not like decades of work. So 1809, the imperial government had enough. Like you'd think that would have happened earlier, but maybe this is just when the whole salt stuff had really gotten going. Like her fleet was like, they were like, okay, they're unstoppable. Like we literally can't stop them. And I think this is when they started being described not as bandits, but as rebels. Like her fleet was so powerful. It was kind of like a civil war level thing. It wasn't just like, oh, here's some like criminals. It's like, oh no, this is like a war. And she like has her own nation effectively. So the imperial government was like, time for international help. So this is like, again, like before sushi, I think. Still, yeah, no, it is. The Chinese government, this is when they're still like really like not letting Westerners in. They despise Westerners. They consider them to be barbarians. but they were just like, we can't stop her. So they enlisted the aid of British, Portuguese, and Dutch war vessels to try and stop her in this kind of like civil war. This was when Richard Glasspool was captured by the pirates, the guy who wrote the thing before about how she had garlic and things. So Glasspool wrote in his account of being captured, he estimated there's 80,000 pirates under her command, with about 1,000 large ships and 800 smaller ships and rowboats. And like, again, like the Imperial Chinese Navy would never have agreed to work with these Western powers, except they were completely desperate. And I mean, needless to say, like she won every battle. Her fleets were better trained, better armed, better supplied, and more numerous than anyone else. So for 2 years, her fleets won battle after battle until the government realized that further attempts to fight her reign would only lead to more death on their side. So instead, they decided to get tricky about it by offering her and most of her crew amnesty. Well, it's kind of like a divide and conquer situation, where I think they offered amnesty to like one of her other captains to try and lure him away, and he took their deal, and she was just like, oh, I see where this is going. So, like, as skilled as she obviously was, the years of expansion and growth had given rise to new power struggles between the fleet leaders who wanted to seize more control for themselves. The Green Flag Fleet waged rebellion against the Red Flag Fleet, and then after suffering a loss, they decided to accept the offer of amnesty, which reduced the number of pirates that Zheng Yi Sao had, like if she lost the whole Green Fleet. So she had to think like not just what was best for herself, but also what was the best for the future for the like tens of thousands of people who depended on her, like not just the pirates, but their wives and their children. Like it was a whole enterprise. And if she had to make the best choice for everybody. And this is again where I just like respect this woman's business sense. She wasn't just like, no, I'll fight until I go down. She's like, let's just accept this deal. So she decided to negotiate a deal, which again, her former skills from her sex work job, like she's really good at negotiating. So she just kind of walked into a government office to talk to a local official. The governor general insisted that she had to entirely relinquish control of all of her ships. And she was like, pass. And she left. And they were like, we really need her to surrender. Can we just give her what she wants? And then eventually the emperor, I guess, was like, yeah, I think we have to. So negotiations stalled for several weeks. And so she seized initiative by approaching unarmed, no weapons, accompanied by a group of just women and children. So like the pirates' wives and children. So I think she showed up in sort of like a grand symbolic gesture to be like, I'm just like a little woman, like, don't be afraid of me. And she went to the highest official in Canton to negotiate in person. And at this point, they like recognized they had to just give her whatever she wanted. And she was successful, which was, it was decided that most of her fleets would disband. So she had 80,000 crew. Of them, only 376 would face punishment for their crimes. I guess they were just like especially, I don't know. All the rest of the crew would be allowed to keep all the wealth they had accumulated, including her. Like she could keep all her money, all her like millions of whatevers. And they all got a full legal pardon. Former pirates would be allowed to pursue careers as soldiers in the military, and sort of like a pension / rehabilitation fund was created to help her finance the transition of her loyal crew from a life at sea to one on the mainland. Like they created like a pension so that like some of the pirates could retire, someone could take new jobs, and like none of them would have to go to jail except for these 376 who I guess were just like real dirtbags. And she herself was given the title Lady by Imperial Decree, and she was cemented into the aristocracy, like in the legal setting. So like literally she got everything she wanted. And so her husband, remember him, Zheng Bozai, he like pivoted to be a naval officer. He became a lieutenant colonel, and then was able to use his pirate knowledge to break up an illegal opium ring. He retired with the rank of colonel, like young retirement. Like, can I just say that she retired from being a pirate at age 35? Like, she became the most powerful pirate in the world, ages 25 to 35. And at age 35, she's just like, okay, early retirement. So he died just a couple years after the retirement. They had a son by now, and so she returned to Canton briefly to raise their son. During the first Opium War, she acted as an advisor to the Qing government to teach how to mobilize the troops and fight at sea. Because if you remember the Opium War we talked about in the sushi episode, that's where China was fighting against Britain and France. which a lot of naval battles. And again, China didn't really have a really good naval apparatus. So they were just like, oh, we don't know how to fight at sea. They like hire her as an advisor. Like the grift of this woman. Like I'm in awe of the way that everything she did is just perfection to me. Other stuff she did, she started a gambling house / brothel, ran a business. I feel like she has the skills for that for sure. She may have become involved in opium smuggling, not sure. And she lived to age 69. Nice. She died in Macau in 1844. So the year she died, Cixi was 9. So that's just around the time that Cixi started helping out her family by sewing and taking on sewing projects and stuff. So I feel like a baton was passed of just like girl boss to girl boss situation. Her legacy. Zheng Yi Sao was, as I said before, and now you understand why, the most powerful pirate in history. Like not just the most powerful lady pirate, not just the most powerful Chinese pirate, like the most powerful pirate in all of history. And like, why is she not more famous? We all know because she was a Chinese woman at her height. So she commanded something like 1,800 ships and an estimated 70,000 men. So in China, this is interesting. This is where I was looking at some of the sources from people in China or like from China. So she's not like, she's becoming like more famous in a Western context. There's like children's picture books about her. She's listed in, like the Rebel Girls and those books like that. But in China, her accomplishments were or have been overshadowed by that of her second husband, Zheng Baozai. So influential Chinese writers such as the Qing official Yan Yonggun, whose book is one of the very few historical sources on Chinese piracy during this period, kind of glossed over her achievements in favor of talking about her second husband, Zheng Baozai. And so he became better known. And I'm going to guess that this guy writing this book was just kind of like, she was a woman, and like I don't like talking about women, and surely she wasn't good at anything, and she was just a big slut or whatever. So from there, like from these written sources, and like again, like not knowing a lot about this, but knowing like a bit about this, a lot of Chinese history, like imperial Chinese history, was really like the emperors and what were they doing, like the history of kind of not the everyday people, because she's not an everyday person, but like the working class, the like criminals, like the sex workers. Like that was not what was recorded by a lot of the official people recording the history of Qing dynasty China. So like, of course we don't know a lot about her, or hadn't known a lot about her. Zheng Baozai appeared as a character. There's this series of films called Once Upon a Time in China. There's like 5 or 7 of them. He's in like the 5th one. He shows up as there's sort of like Jet Li stars in them. And he plays this kind of folk hero, kind of like a Davy Crockett type person, but Chinese. And Zheng Baozai is a villain in one of those movies, the 5th movie. He appears as an incredibly old man because the movie is set like when he, as a human, would have been like 100 years old. But he appears as a pirate turned naval commander. There was an entire TV series about him called Captain of Destiny in 2015. And in this series, his wife, Zheng Yi Sao, is kind of like a small role. She's just shown as to be a kidnapped woman from a well-to-do family with little agency. And as I said, so it's in Western media that her reputation kind of developed. So she appeared so the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges wrote a book in 1935 called A Universal History of Infamy, which I've not read, but I think I will. So she appears in that as the Widow Qing. In 2007, there was a character based strongly on her in one of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End from 2007. She shows up in that, although in that, which I have not seen, she's depicted as a heavily made up brothel madame. And that movie is set like before she was born. So again, like the time period of when she was doing her shit was kind of like not the time period of the movies made that she's in. She appeared in earlier this year in 2022. There's an episode of Doctor Who called Legend of the Sea Devils, and she appeared in that. And that's part of why I wanted to talk about her on the podcast, because I saw that episode of Doctor Who and I was like, ooh, I want to, like that really, people have been suggesting her. I should learn more about this cool Chinese pirate person. In 2020, Chinese audiences at last got a TV series devoted to Zheng Yi Sao, in which she was depicted as a folk hero who rallies the pirates to protect the poor and weak and helps to quash the opium trade, which is like I'm not entirely sure. Her history with the opium trade, was she pro? Was she con? I don't know. And then I found this really interesting. So recently, there's a play, I'm not sure if it's still playing, but in London, England, produced by Paper Gang Theatre called Asian Pirate Musical. And it was produced by like people of Asian heritage. And it seems kind of like a Six, the musical, which I'm sure you've all heard about Henry VIII's wives. A similar sort of thing where they're sort of interrogating the way that Asian pirates are discussed in media. So in the show, her character kind of criticizes the fact that she's known as Zheng Yi Sao. She says, first wife of Pirate Chang, I cannot believe that is the name that's stuck. So it sounds like a really great steps are happening to sort of like just get people more talking about her and recognizing how cool she was. And I'm just impressed. I'm just like, I love it. I love a leader who's good at it, who's well suited for it. I love the fact that just like no one could ever defeat her. No one ever did. Like, love her. So I don't know enough about either of her husbands to nominate anyone for the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance, but I do appreciate that her husbands clearly didn't get in her way. In terms of scandaliciousness, like I feel like the fact that it's funny because she did so well, I almost forget that like she's a pirate and everything she was doing was illegal, and because I was just like cheering for her so much, but like she was a sex worker turned pirate, which are both things that historically, in I think almost every cultural context, are seen as scandalous by like the establishment. But like this is a 10 for scandaliciousness. She was a unstoppable pirate queen. Her scheminess, I would give her more than 10 if I could. Again, like the word schemy, I think has some like unpleasant connotations when you're talking about like Asian women. So please know that I mean this in terms of just like resiliency, smartness, just like all the plans, the way she took over the salt trade, like she's coming up with these plans. And there wasn't a way I don't think she ever was educated in school because like there wasn't school in China then. But like she did this without getting an MBA program. You know, there wasn't like someone who was a mentor to be like, why don't you diversify your portfolio? Like what? Like she just came up with all this herself. Like the scheminess, out of control, 10 plus if I could. Her significance, I think, frankly, is also a 10 because she was the most successful pirate there ever was. And even if she was not well known afterwards, the significance she had at the time, like amount of people who she provided employment for, the fact that when the pirate fleet broke up, they all got pensions and new careers and stuff, just kind of like the ripple effects of how many people's lives she would have affected, and how many people she killed. The effect on the salt trade is just like she was a hugely impactful figure in this region, in this world, and also she was the most successful pirate of all time, which is frankly a 10. Where I think she's not getting a perfect mark, so is with a sexism bonus, because like how much did the patriarchy hold her back? And I feel like not at all. I feel like, I mean, yeah, she wouldn't have become a pirate queen unless she married the pirate. And what were the circumstances of her marrying the pirate? Was that something she wanted to do? I don't know. And then she like took another husband so she could kind of keep control so people wouldn't worry about her being a woman, but like she did. And kind of like sushi, like, yeah, it was this like massively patriarchal culture. But she kind of saw that and was like, okay, well, here's the loophole I'm just going to take to be the best person in the world. And she did. So the sexism, I don't think, got in her way. You know, it's like, would she have wanted to have been working on a flower boat if that was like, clearly she had more skills than just doing that? I don't know. I'm going to give her a 5 for sexism just because of like, had she been able to do all this earlier, maybe she would have done more cool stuff, but like it truly didn't get in her way that much. I don't know. I'm just giving her a 5 because I want to give her the highest mark possible because I love her. And where that puts her on the scandalous scale, so she's a 35. The same score as Shi, the other Chinese woman who lived just after her. And I'll just give you the breakdown. I am going to at some point on my next hiatus, maybe, hopefully, have time to like put the Fredigan Memorial Scandalous Scale online somewhere so you can see it. But for now, I'll just relate it to you, which is that, just let me see. The top 11, 9 of them are from this season. So at this point, the top score anyone's ever gotten is Fredigan with a 38, Queen Margot 37.5, Manuela Sanz 37, and Jinga and Harem Sultan both a 36. La Chevalière Deon, Malancine, and Queen Min all have a 35.5. Shi has a 35, Zheng Yi Sao, 35. And then Christina of Sweden is in 11th place, 33.5. So, like, if anything, with this internationale season, other than just like me learning so much interesting stuff, and I love how my knowledge of world history has expanded to learn about all these tits out women from all these other eras and times. But I also love that women from all these other eras and times are just like killing it on the Scandalicious scale. And again, so I said like this is the season finale of season 5 Vulgar History Internationale. But next week there is going to be another episode, which is going to be the 3rd annual Tits Out Festive Holiday Spectacular. And it's definitely got some cameo appearances by people we've talked about in Vulgar History. I think it's going to be a very special holiday special. So that's coming up next week. And gosh, so like we're getting really close to Hanukkah. We're getting close to Christmas at the time you're listening to this. So I hope your holidays are not too stressful and you're finding moments of, tits out, pants on happiness. And I do want to mention, again, if you need like a last minute gift, if you hit me up with a message, I can record a little message for a loved one that you might have who is a fan of this podcast, just like a little audio file of me wishing them Merry Christmas or whatever. You can get more information about that. Just send me a message, and all the ways you can send me messages. So you can send me messages, you can email vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. If you go to vulgarhistory.com, there's a contact me form. And also I'm on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod, which is like, don't just go there just to send me a message. Like you can, but also there's like pictures there. Usually after the episodes, I'm all over the stories with polls and questions and things. I'm also on TikTok at Vulgar History. I'm still figuring things out there, but having a nice time so far. And I have to say that TikTok, Tits Out Brigade, there's a pun in there and I am too tired to think of it. The Ticks Out Brigade, I'm not sure, has been very welcoming and nice. And so I'm spending more and more time there. So that's where you can find me as well. And there's the store. I don't know if I'm going to be adding any new merch at this point, but I will for sure, like next year, start looking at doing some more merch as well. And I do think freelance pirate is a strong option here, or just like girl boss pirate. I don't know. Again, let me know. Send me a message what you think would be good for a t-shirt. The merch store is at vulgarhistory.store, and you can always use promo code TITSOUT for free shipping in the US or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. And then also if you go to bookshop.org/shop/vulgarhistory, I've got a list of all the books that I've ever recommended on the show, including the biographies I use when I'm researching, but also there's a list of historical fiction, and there's a list of just like recommended books for book giving. And if you buy stuff through that specific link from bookshop.org, then a little money goes to support this podcast. Oh, and there's also Patreon. You can join our Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. And that is where, so if you pledge $1 a month, then you get early ad-free access to all the episodes of Vulgar History. If you pledge at least $2 a month, you get the early access. Plus also you can vote on polls to help me decide various things that I need help deciding. If you pledge at least $5 a month or more, then you get access to the other super special maxi-sodes, I call them because they're really long. So there's this asshole where I talk about men from history. I've talked about Genghis Khan. I'm going to be talking about that guy. His name escapes me at the moment, but I will know it very well after I do the episode. The one in the sushi story, the guy who like started this spiritual rebellion where he thought he was Jesus's younger brother, etc. We'll be talking about him. And then also Vulgar Peace Theater. You get access to those episodes for pledging or donating at least $5 a month. And that's where I talk about costume dramas from history with friends of the podcast and also authors whose books would make great gifts. Alison Epstein and Lana Whit Johnson. So we did Queen Margot last month. This month we're doing A Knight's Tale. I think that episode comes out at the time you're hearing this. It's going to come out this upcoming Saturday. Anyway, again, like this is not goodbye forever. This is I will talk to you again next week. So until then, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both created and were created by the threads disentangled from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Tilly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children! Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.